thank you everyone for joining us today. We're just delighted to be able to be here today with Tia Levings. And I want to just introduce the WMC Talks, which we recently launched at the Women's Media Center to be able to have public conversations with thinkers like you that really should be exposed to so many more people all the time.
Yeah.
And so, firstly, I want to jump in with a short bio that I will ask you to elaborate on. You wrote a very important book, The Well Trained Wife, that not only turned out to be obviously a personal story, but to be a really deeply of the moment political story. And you have another book coming out in May, I Belong to Me. Could you talk about how you came to write the book that you wrote and the one you're about to release?
Yeah.
And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So, A Well Trained Wife is my personal memoir of how I got into and then escaped from high control Christian patriarchy. It is sometimes I call it the real life prequel to The Handmaid's Tale. And I started writing it really as a therapeutic journal. I escaped violence, domestic abuse. I call it church sanctioned domestic abuse because everything I lived in, my church had taught was the way families should be.
Mhm.
It was a dominant head of household with a submissive wife and you know, strict discipline and strict religiosity and this
Mhm.
very devout trad life. And we followed it to its natural conclusion. It was a very violent conclusion. And I escaped in 2007 and began trauma healing before there was really a phrase out there called trauma
Mhm.
healing. In 2007, we didn't really have the language around deconstruction or religious trauma or complex PTSD wasn't even really discussed, and
Right.
mental health was just exploding online as far as resources and therapeutic modalities and things. So, um, I kind of was a trailblazer in my own healing, and that included writing my story. And it
Mhm.
started as a, like I said, therapeutic journal that then became a novel and then a memoir with a pseudonym. And I was growing in my confidence and courage to speak in the power of my own voice. And by the time we got to about 2019, had done that. And so I sold it under my own name as my story, and it is extremely timely. I like to think I wish it could be a view of hindsight of what happened, but instead it is continuing to be prophetic because the
Yeah.
religious forces and the political leaders that were my villains in my story 15, 20 years ago are in government now.
Mhm.
So it is here for the whole country. Um, After I sold and started discussing A Well Trained Wife online before it came out, very quickly I started getting these DMs. Me too, me too. How did you heal? How did you get
Mhm.
to this place where you could speak about it? And so I Belong to Me is a self-help sort of, I mean, it's not prescriptive. It'll be on a self-help guide, a shelf, but it is, the story, it is the steps I took to heal, which was
Mhm.
a little bit trailblazy because, like I said, I was in new territory and just deeply committed to the idea that I was not gonna stay broken forever.
Mhm.
I didn't wanna continue to attract predators to my life. I wanted to, discover autonomy and selfhood, and I didn't have a sense of self. That was the big reveal of cult recovery, was that I had all this violence that I lived through, and people always
Mhm.
assume that the violence is the hardest thing to recover from, but the actual hardest part was that I was 33 and didn't know who I was, and that
Right.
is because I had been indoctrinated and groomed to only exist in this very high control, narrow lane, and when I was out in the world where people expected me to behave like an adult, I didn't know what an adult really did. So,
Right.
yeah, so I
Well,
Belong to
and
Me is
that's
that. It's a love letter to survivors.
yeah, and I think to your point, the idea that girls and women are socialized in Christian culture, particularly white patriarchal Christian culture, to be pleasers,
Right,
to evacuate their sense of self, um,
exactly.
is currently, and I will note to people who are here that they should go find this article in the New York Times. One of the rationales given for household voting, for this idea that men should vote as representatives of their households, wives, and families, and so I think that's really salient, what you're describing. Both you and I think, have the kinds of brains that connect the deeply personal to the very political. Because I think if you've had some of these experiences and you're thinking about it, it becomes just the most logical path. It is clear that
Mhm.
it scales up, that this
Yeah.
scales up. And one of the topics that I'd really like to talk about is the dynamics of power, control, and abuse that it that people experience in intimate settings, like the one that you were in, like what you write about, and the way that this administration and its key actors have gendered politics to the degree that the polity itself is the abused spouse.
Yes. Yes, we are collectively the battered spouse right now. That is
Mhm,
absolutely true. So this is another area where my pattern making brain really helped me.
mhm,
And also my deconstruction process, which is a lot of I belong to me, is this excavation of what happened, learning how to name what happened, and then why. And as I traced it back, why, I got into the religious roots, and
mhm,
that was very gendered, and it was very, high control and authoritarian, and it had this view of God that became progressively Old Testament, and I wasn't allowed to vote, and we did, practice head of household voting, and I
mhm,
always knew that it was their plan for the national strategy.
mhm.
So, when we widen the lens like that, and then that group takes control because it is the exact same players, the
Yes,
biggest villain in my story is Doug Wilson, he's a
yes.
pastor.
Can you
Doug
explain Doug
Wilson.
Wilson
Yeah,
for
Doug
for
Wilson
people
is
who
the
are unfamiliar, even if they've seen a passing video?
Sure, sure. So a good way, so like the Presbyterians have split in multiple directions, and one of those directions was Doug Wilson took himself off and went and formed his own Presbyterian denomination called the Covenant. I think it's right now it's the Congregation of Reformed Evangelical Churches, and used to be the Confederation. So there is very much white, racist,
Yes.
patriarchal roots in here. But he basically couldn't get along with others. So he started his own town, he took over a town. He started his own college, printing press, denomination. And so he has these church plants of CREC churches. And he is a theonomist. So that is the belief that the Old Testament legislative type code in Leviticus and Deuteronomy should be applied to American modern penal code. So there isn't a lot of Jesus. So when you encounter this idea of like, what kind of Christians are that mean or that harsh? And what does that have to do with Jesus? It's because they don't really talk about Jesus that much. It goes from basically the Old Testament to Paul. It's very crusader language, dominion, like they want dominion of the
Yeah.
whole world.
Angry father.
Exactly, very angry father, and their view of God is a very narcissistic, angry father. So
Mhm,
when you take that movement, that patriarchal, mean daddy is gonna spank you kind of mentality, and then you join it with a populist president like Donald Trump, who is also authoritarian and also very narcissistic and likes to be called daddy and will punish you and take you on this ride. You
mhm,
now have conflated the energies. One section is doing it very from religious standpoint.
mhm,
He's doing it from a very, domineering political, fear, basically. He doesn't wanna get in trouble, he doesn't want accountability.
mhm.
Um, and the women and the people are supposed to submit and obey the
Right.
first time.
And
So
media is colluding, like
completely.
completely colluding,
Yeah.
because when you hear people with massive platforms making daddy spanking jokes
Mhm.
about the president, right? It's only a
Yeah.
wink wink joke because it's just all dog whistle coding for
Yeah.
what you're describing, it seems to me.
And as somebody who like, my story has domestic discipline in it, which is wife spanking,
Mhm,
which is not the only way they discipline women. They also deny privileges, put you in timeout,
right.
take your keys, isolation, extra prayer and fasting. But as somebody who's lived through that, when I hear those kinds of jokes, I'm reminded of how many times that was ever present in our culture. Like patriarchy has been with us, but it hasn't been allowed to be in power as we've had these other very social
Right.
movements to
Balancing
get,
it.
yeah, exactly. And so, like, there's always been like Taming of the Shrew or 1950s movies where women get spanked.
Mhm.
This one never really went away, but this Donald Trump gave them the elevation to political power,
Right.
and they're just ready, to take his bluster and bring in strategy. So it is a dangerous mix because somebody like him is so chaotic and disorganized
Mhm,
alone. He doesn't have that infrastructure inside of him, but
mhm.
they do. They have their
Right.
external structure to bring to it.
So it's interesting. I grew up Catholic and have written extensively about that not being for me by the time I was 11. I'm like, I
Mhm.
do this, bye bye, not for me.
Yeah.
This is really all kinds of ways wrong. Right. But I think what's interesting about Trump, if you think of the Venn diagram of the theocrats, the tech bros, the manfluencers and manosphere, the laundering in mainstream media, the Catholic Brain Trust from the Claremont Institute. Like they're all of these very patriarchal, almost all but not entirely white supremacist in their ideologies, movements that separately couldn't have achieved this,
Right.
but that they came together at this particular moment, coalescing around this man. And a lot of people talk about it in terms of a cult. You mentioned cult modalities. Can you talk about that? Because I think it's hard a lot of the times to really fathom what that means and how it can be true.
Yeah. So again, this is a really great time in history to break out of something and heal because we have resources and language that
Mhm.
didn't exist before. And so there are cult standards and criteria. Stephen Hassan has the bite model. Daniela Nespianek Young has another list of what
Yes.
it's like. We can look at it
The
and
many
say,
anchored
yeah,
experts.
models. So I understood I was in a cult at the time because I had signed Doug Wilson's churches a lot require you sign a covenant of membership. No one gets in unless they have signed, like, you're not in the church, you're not a member of the church unless you sign this, and then I was formally excommunicated for writing in my own name and writing about Mary, the mother of God, and both of those things were forbidden only because women are not supposed to have voices apart from their
Right.
husbands. So, I knew enough about cults, but, from my own reading that I was like, "This is really closed." But it would be in recovery where I would learn about family cults, one-to-one cults, these, like, expanded models, ideological cults where, I knew I was in a prison of mind control. They didn't have actual bars on my windows, but I also knew I, like, couldn't step out of my belief system without being completely cut off and exiled. They dictated everything we said and did. Everything had to be uniform. Like, we hit check, 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 all of the models,
Mhm.
and this MAGA cult, which I think it's just in a broader sense. It is a mind control ideology that you have to crack from something like that. You can't cognitively change your mind about something. That's why like more information doesn't really do it. They
Right.
have to have something that really cracks their understanding. And
Mhm.
then it cracks open, like a cacophony of awareness. But that's really the struggle of our time right now.
So how do you relate this to what to the trad wife? People call it a trad wife movement. I think largely it's an aesthetic
Mhm.
and that it's being politically mobilized and weaponized. Um, the trad wife influencer drivers themselves are honestly, they just remind me of no one so much as Phyllis Schlafly because they're talking a talk.
Mhm.
They're engaging in the pretense of nostalgia and slowness and care while they are in fact working very hard, very
Yeah.
digitally savvy, they're working, they're making money from what they're doing, right?
Right.
So you have that trad wife world that is multidimensional. Can you talk about the relationship between that and the way the right wing is leveraging that, or at least I think really strongly promoting it and
Mhm.
leveraging it. It's not
Mhm.
just that they're
Yeah.
leveraging something that's existing, right?
Mhm.
And what you just described, because obviously there's something about the nostalgia that resonates with a lot of people, even if they have no idea of what you're talking about in terms of history, religion, political movements. How do you
Yeah.
reconcile those? I mean, it's complicated, but how do you talk about them?
Well, when I was a tradwife in the '90s, we just didn't have the internet, and this is the flip
Yeah.
side of having so many resources on the internet. It's a propaganda model, it's a sales
Right.
model,
It is.
and it's the soft sell, it's the aesthetic that draws you into it, and why does it draw you into it? It's the same reason fundamentalism is appealing. It offers you a simple solution to a
Mhm.
very complex world. They help make that complex world very overwhelming, and then you have no choice really but to go home. And then where are you gonna funnel and fuel all your ambition and
Mhm.
interest and talent as a woman? You're going to be a professional mom, you're going to really turn this inward.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of both and here. The right
Mhm.
wing does fund tradwives. It is mechanized at a high level, and then you have the second other level of women who are just their earnest content creators. It's beautiful, and they're taking things that we love and they agendize it and weaponize it against
Mhm.
us as part of the system. There's nothing wrong with baking bread or staying home with your children,
Mhm.
but if you're doing it to prop up the patriarchy's message, now you're complicit in that message. And you may benefit from it directly, like a paycheck, or you may just find belonging and affirmation in it. Either
Mhm.
way, you're participating
You're
in the
participating.
movement. Right. And the first thing that patriarchy does is make women complicit, because you're not likely to leave if the very first thing you have to contend with is your own guilt, and that you're the one that brought this into your home. You're
Mhm.
the one that instituted this. You're the hands and feet that is applying the principles, spanking the children,
Mhm.
establishing the structure. It's one of those ways that keep women in. But when I talk about patriarchy in the larger sense, like their ultimate goal is women out of the public sector,
Right.
and they will achieve that through multiple ends. They will try to legislate us home. They
Mhm.
will try to deny our rights, bill by bill by bill, and they will do this soft sell through other women. So
And education, just
exactly,
literally
deny our
increasing
education,
education,
just cut it,
higher education.
cut our jobs, cut our access to
Yeah.
loans, cut our access to divorce. Anything that's going to narrow our world as slowly as it narrows
Mhm.
as you go. So, yeah, it's you wake up one day and you find out you can't get out. Is what happens. It's
So
that
how would
traps.
you characterize now? I mean, we've touched on white supremacy, racial dynamics. Um, I think that that's always complicated to explain. And in particular, I think with what's going on today, and I have the manosphere in my mind. The manosphere is a global phenomenon. It's extremely diverse. It's expanding. And I think it's important to think about what are essentially local, but national manifestations of that. And the the trad wife movement, I think, reflects a lot of that, but is also expanding in a way that might be considered more diverse and that leverages a history, for example, in this country of Black women not being able to be trad wives
Right.
in history, right?
Mhm.
So can you talk about that a little bit too?
One of the things I talk about a lot is how the patriarchy runs their homes, is how they want to run the country. So when
Mhm.
you want to know what their ultimate goal is, you have to look at the way they live their home lives. I don't see very many women of color in as trad wives, and there's a reason for that, because in patriarchy, back in the times that they're romanticizing, brown people were the labor force, children are the labor force, women are the labor force. So you don't have a lot of diversity in the end goal either. Like it's going to be this, like they're going to use our class system, they're going to enhance
Right.
those divisions, they're going to use gender, they're going to use race. Because ultimately, who's the only person in patriarchy who has really any agency and say is a white landowning man.
Right.
Doug Wilson's group does like they do favor what they call idealistic slavery or ideal slavery.
Mhm.
This is not like
They're overt about it.
they're very overt about it, and they're
Right.
emboldened. Trump gave them that. They're emboldened to say all this quiet stuff out loud now.
Mhm.
So it's actually kind of helpful, because as survivors, sometimes we have to convince people that this is real, and then they will just get on there and say it themselves. And so
Right.
like this is what they're talking about. This is why this is happening.
Right.
Um, so yeah, so I don't the manosphere is actually more diverse than the tradwife movement is,
Yes, it
and
is.
they have, sections of it that aren't necessarily religious, but they are still appealing to misogyny, and they are still appealing to male scarcity,
Mhm.
like power scarcity, which is always endangering for women. So, um, yeah, I think it's
Yeah,
knowing the traits that and how they
right.
overlap in these movements is really
And it's a
important.
spectrum, right? Because there's this
Mhm.
big turn in Gen Z men towards traditional, particularly Catholic faith. And the Catholic faith, some might say, is just not as extreme.
Depends where you're at,
It
right?
depends on where you at. That's
Yes.
right. I'm like, I'm not one of the some
Uh-huh.
myself, right? But I think that there's a certain laundering of these ideas that happens along the way that makes
Mhm.
them seem more palatable,
Right.
And so do you have any thoughts or advice for people who are seeing this big picture scaled up
Mhm.
um, for how to have a critical lens. If you are not from this background, if you haven't really thought of it in terms of narcissism, abuse, power domination, you and I spoke a little earlier about the power and domination kind of wheel, the way it plays out intimately, and how you can map that into politics today.
Yeah.
But how, for someone who hasn't been in that relationship personally,
Mhm.
what are some signs to look for? What are some healthy habits to cultivate to enhance what is effectively citizenship for democracy?
I bring this really home. It's very intimate in my body.
Hmm.
I pay attention to what I'm feeling. I name what I'm feeling, and then I say, why would someone want me to feel that way? What benefit is someone else getting
Yes,
from
that's
me
right.
being dysregulated? Why am I scared? Why do I feel guilty? Is there something they're trying to achieve or manipulate me with through using guilt as a tool? I can't know that unless I know what's happening in myself.
Mhm.
So when I'm dysregulated, this is why trauma recovery and embodiment has been so important for me. It's because that's what helps me focus on me. My job is me, and so if I'm feeling something, why and who's benefiting from it, and why would they benefit from it, and why would they use it this way? That helps me out in like a day to day interaction with a controlling person and a national scare such as an entire civilization's
Right.
wiped out. So like it's this you start to see those patterns because the response in your body is the same. Another one is like, are you afraid to say something because you're going to get in trouble?
Mhm.
That is not something that normal healthy adults in discourse worry about. So if you're worried you're going to get in trouble for doing something, you already have information about the person you'll get in trouble with, how
Mhm.
high control they are, how what kind of dynamic is top down or is it equal.
Mhm.
I think a big problem in our society is that we haven't taught men how to deal with women who are equal, and so they are scared because they don't know. They know there's a difference, but they don't know how to navigate that difference.
Mhm.
So, like identifying why are young men so afraid? Why is the church? So the high control groups always do the same thing to young people. They need soldiers and breeders. And
Right.
so they create this chaotic environment and then they offer the structure and solution.
Mhm.
Here, come here. If you just go ahead and get married at 18, um,
Yeah. Do
go
the
ahead and have
things.
lots of children before you're ready. They actually said that from stage at CPAC. Have as many children as you can before you're even ready to have them. Um, and, and just do this. We'll get your kids. And
Mhm.
then later on, the consequences will manifest or not. So
Right.
yeah. So it's I don't remember where I was going with that, but is
Well, I mean, I
yeah.
think, yeah, what really resonated with me too when you said that is how important progressive parenting is in
Yes.
this moment. Because I think in my experience, I've spent a lot of time with parents, but also in schools, colleges and high schools.
Mhm.
A lot of adults still have a very top-down authoritarian mode of parenting, even if they don't call it that, where
Right.
there are rules and there's authority and there's no questioning and you do what you're told and that makes you a good person.
Mhm.
And I always push back and say, it's really important not to forget the structure of thought behind what you're doing as an adult with parents, whether with children, whether you're a parent, a teacher, a coach, an administrator, just anybody influencing parents can model a system that a child will either be socialized to accede to or not, right? They'll
Right.
either be
Right.
socialized they'll be predisposed to obey, or they'll be predisposed to resist and
That's
question,
such a good point. It's true.
you
Yeah.
know?
Obedience culture, that's one of the things we're caught up in right now.
Yes,
And,
for
and boomers were not, they were not progressively parented, so this top down fear is
yeah.
actually being kind of reflected in Gen Z, and Gen Z is being like nurtured because they grew up in total chaos, between
Right.
10 years of Trump's presidencies plus COVID. Um, they have come up in legitimately intimidating and overwhelmed times. And
Well, I think too.
fundamentalism's so attractive to that. Like,
Yeah.
here's the solution.
But to your point earlier, I always say Gen Z is 2 generations because the
Mm,
polarization is gendered and it's massive. It's bigger than any other. And so
yeah.
you have very progressive women,
Mhm.
30% of whom don't identify as straight. That's massive.
That's
That
massive.
there's right?
30?
30% is huge. And those women are not they are not doing that. It's really
Right.
much more likely, despite the trad wife movement, that young men are gravitating towards authoritarianism politically, religiously, personally, and so I think it's important maybe for us to look back and think, how did that split happen? And I have ideas, you have ideas,
Mhm.
but what makes it so notable? Because I do think it is notable,
Yeah.
that they had different outcomes during the same period of time, and some of that I think was post 9/11 resilience ideals in the culture. Some of it was gaming and sex segregation in technology. um, but I think it's really one of the most interesting questions we face right now.
Mhm. It's really interesting to me. The something I talk about with a more increased awareness now is how everybody suffers under patriarchy. It's not just
Yeah,
the women
that's
who
right.
suffer, and also like it increases the burden on young men. So like
For
they
sure.
when they have to treat their partner as a dependent, they don't have a teammate and a partner. They have increased their own burden.
Right.
And that's just more to carry in an already heavy world. So they don't benefit from that. And the more that we can talk about, I think, like, the actual outcomes of this model. We know what it's like to live this way. We've done this before. And if we're not going to learn from history but repeat it, then that's on us, if we're
Right.
not learning from history. So um nobody's better off in the 1850s. Nobody's better off in the 1950s.
Right.
Um
Right. I mean, the way the I wrote a book published it last year on male supremacy, and one of the reasons that I wrote the book was to clearly articulate the way in which it is a system
mhm,
based on the idea of men's superiority, particularly cis straight men, and it is first and foremost a system that dehumanizes men, forces them to compete and to use other people to win.
that's right.
And it's very hard though, because part of the dynamic of male supremacy, patriarchy, etc., is that men don't listen to women as authorities,
Mhm,
which is exactly what happens in all of these cultures in our politics, and I don't want to brush that over and pretend that it's not real, because I think it's a real obstacle. So again, to go
mhm.
back to the way individuals respond, to the way families respond, the way communities can respond, um, would you say that there are mechanisms for more egalitarian images of authority that would help? You know?
Help? I mean, I don't know. I'm a little bit ambivalent on this because anytime we're getting, like, a little better,
Mm,
it's hard. It's hard because like, this is probably my background in all or nothing and extremes that I'm always having to deconstruct and work through. I want something that is, not more equal, because more equal is
yes,
still
I
not
agree.
there. So it's tricky because we also have to take baby steps and accept progress where we can take it. But and I tend to be somebody who's like, as long as we're moving forward and we're using our moral imagination to really
Mhm.
envision the world we want, every step forward is progress. But at the same time, like, the placating that happens in patriarchy
Oh,
and in
it is
and in yes,
real.
yeah, it's real.
Well, and
And
the centering. This is
yeah,
the issue, because
yeah.
in order to encourage men to listen,
Mhm.
which is what we need to listen to what you're saying, you have to recenter them, and there's always a risk
Yeah.
once you do that. And I
Yeah.
think it's a genuine dilemma for many people.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I can understand the decentering movement, certainly, and I think feminism itself is a decentering movement.
Yeah.
But again, as you say, in the day to day, and honestly, I think it's the corrosiveness of using care against us, using our love, using our affection.
Oh, yeah. I
You
was
know?
just this morning dealing with weaponized empathy. I'm like,
Yeah,
whoa, I am a deeply empathetic person, and when someone uses that against me or to weaken me, it's a different kind of injury,
yeah.
than when I'm out there being dumb.
But it is the lever of so much
Right.
else.
Yeah, it is.
Well, sorry.
I'm just amazed we're at a half hour already.
I know, I know. Well, I am very cognizant of your time and everyone else's
Yes.
time. Is there anything you would like to close with? Can you tell people where to find you?
Yes.
Um,
On all platforms, I'm at Tia Levings Writer. The book comes out May 5th. I do believe that self-belonging and self-sovereignty is the key that helps us do all this other work. So that's when I say do our work. This is the map forward. It's a warm coffee chat between friends. It's not prescriptive.
oh, that's
So
so lovely.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a delight to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, everyone.